Imagine looking at a city that is, absolutely dying of thirst. The situation is dire. The wells are totally dry. And then finally, someone builds this massive billion-gallon water reservoir right on the edge of town. You'd probably look at that and think, well, thank goodness the crisis is finally over.
Right, yeah. Naturally, you see a giant pool of water, you assume it just flows downhill and everyone gets a drink. It's a very comforting, um, very linear way to look at the world.
But then you walk over to the reservoir and you realize the only pipe connecting that massive body of water to the actual city is it's like the size of a standard garden hose.
Wow, right.
Suddenly, it hits you that the sheer volume of water sitting in that reservoir doesn't really matter at all if the infrastructure to move it is just completely inadequate. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we are bringing you into the actual mechanics, the plumbing, if you will, of global climate finance. We're working from a highly detailed, peer-reviewed briefing titled The Climate-Nature Nexus in Practice. This is issue number 8, dated July 18th, 2026.
Yeah, and our focus for you today is really unpacking a central, frankly, fascinating paradox in the global economy right now. We're going to explore exactly why a record-breaking pool of climate funding just isn't necessarily reaching the local conservation projects that, need it the most.
Right.
We're looking at that gap between a headline-grabbing financial commitment and, well, a verified living tree in the ground.
Exactly, because the headlines are definitely grabbing our attention. Just recently, the multilateral development banks, these are the massive international financial institutions like the World Bank, they just announced a staggering $163 billion in climate finance commitments for 2025.
Massive number.
It's huge. And out of that total, $103 billion is earmarked specifically for low and middle income economies. And the piece that really jumped off the page for me was that adaptation finance for those specific economies is up 31%, hitting $35 billion. Okay, let's unpack this. I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Wait, a 31% increase in adaptation finance sounds like an absolute, undeniable win. Shouldn't we be celebrating this massive tool of money? I mean, $163 billion?
Oh, it definitely makes for a great press release.
Right.
But this is exactly where we have to look closely at the terminology and how global finance actually operates. That $163 billion figure represents committed finance.
Okay.
It's reported under a joint tracking methodology used by these development banks. And in the world of institutional finance, committed is very, very different from actual on-the-ground disbursements.
So wait, when they say committed, what does that actually look like in practice? Is it just a handshake?
It's essentially a formal promise on a ledger. It means the bank has approved the funding in principle and set it aside for a specific, usually broad category. But it is miles away from a check actually cashing in a local bank account. And it is even further away from generating a verified ecological outcome on the ground.
Yeah.
Plus, the report doesn't even disaggregate how much of this specifically supports nature-based solutions.
So it could be going to like a solar farm instead of restoring a wetland?
Exactly. And that brings us to the central thesis of the briefing. A record aggregate number is not some magical dedicated pool of cash that a vulnerable country can just dip a bucket into whenever they want.
Yay.
Volume is only one of 4 simultaneous constraints that a project has to navigate.
Which brings us to the first real-world bottleneck. Let's look at what happens when a vulnerable region actually tries to access this money. The briefing details this workshop that took place in Nadi, Fiji, in mid-July 2026.
Yeah, involving the Pacific Islands Forum.
Exactly. And the math here is just jarring.
It really paints a picture of the severe friction in the international system. Regional estimates show the climate action costs for the Pacific, and keep in mind this is based on costed plans for only part of the region, are going to be somewhere near $13.2 billion by around 2030.
Wow.
Yeah, they need that just to survive rising sea levels and intensifying storms.
Okay, so they need $13.2 billion. Look at what they actually managed to receive over an entire decade between 2010 and 2021. Roughly $3.4 billion.
Yeah.
They're staring down an existential crisis. The global banks are waving around $163 billion, yet over 10 years, the Pacific only pulled in a fraction of what they need.
Why? Is it because the banks just don't think their projects are worthwhile?
Not at all. The sources point out that the barrier isn't a lack of willingness to fund Pacific projects. The barriers are the incredibly complex eligibility rules and the, frankly, brutal accreditation processes.
Yeah.
To get this money, a country has to meet stringent fiduciary standards. Let's pause there, because we hear fiduciary standards a lot. What does that actually mean for a small island nation trying to get a grant?
It means proving to an international bank that your local institutions have the accounting practices, the anti-corruption protocols, and the environmental and social safeguard documentation of a first world financial entity.
Oh, wow.
Right. And for a small island nation's government, which might have, I don't know, a total staff of 3 people in their environmental ministry,
Hmm,
achieving that standard is monumentally expensive.
I bet.
You have to hire international consultants, generate hyper-specific baseline data, and essentially restructure your internal government operations just to submit the application.
So let me get this straight.
Yeah.
You essentially have to spend millions of dollars just to prove to the bank that you are responsible enough to handle the millions of dollars you are asking for.
Precisely. The fixed transaction cost of simply applying for a multi-million-dollar climate grant can entirely deplete the scarce resources a vulnerable state was hoping to use to actually, build a seawall or restore a coral reef.
That is maddening. It's like winning a massive grant for your community, but to claim it, you have to navigate a bureaucratic maze so expensive and complex that you spend half the grant money just proving you deserve it.
Yeah, it creates an access bottleneck that is practically insurmountable for the smallest states.
How do the sources suggest we actually fix this?
Well, the briefing frames this as a joint system design problem. Development finance institutions can't just pat themselves on the back for increasing the total pool of money on their ledgers. They shouldn't force vulnerable states into a choice between more money existing globally and better access to it locally.
Right.
The solution is that these institutions need to vastly expand concessional finance.
Which means loans at below market interest rates or outright grants.
Right, correct. Financing that doesn't plunge the country into unmanageable debt. But crucially, they must offer this concessional finance while heavily investing in radically simplified delivery systems specifically tailored for small states.
So the Pacific situation illustrates the bottleneck of simply accessing the capital. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that a project actually navigates that maze. The money is approved, the check clears.
Okay.
Now we hit a totally different problem. Once the money gets there, how do you govern it? This brings us to Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam.
Yes, on July 15, 2026, Vietnam's Decree Number 180 on forest carbon services went into effect.
Right.
If the Pacific Islands represent the struggle to open the valve on climate finance, this new Vietnamese decree is an attempt to build a highly engineered, leak-proof container at the end of the line.
The details in this decree are intense. It sets a comprehensive national framework for how forest carbon services are handled. It dictates rules for project registration, measurement, reporting, and eligible activities like REDD plus Gary.
Yeah.
For anyone not living and breathing climate policy, what exactly is a REDD plus activity?
REDD plus stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. In simple terms, it's a framework where developing countries are financially rewarded for keeping their forests standing, rather than, say, cutting them down for timber or agriculture.
Makes sense.
But to get paid, you have to prove scientifically and legally that the carbon is actually staying in those trees.
Which brings us to the most critical part of Vietnam's decree. It establishes a strict prohibition on transferring the same carbon credit twice. You called this out earlier as the bedrock of the whole system. Walk us through how double counting even happens and why it's so destructive.
Let's use an analogy. Imagine you're selling tickets to a concert. You sell seat 4A to a guy in New York, and then you turn around and sell that exact same seat 4A to a woman in London. You've committed fraud.
Obviously.
Only one person can sit in the seat. In the carbon market, a credit is proof that 1 ton of carbon was absorbed by a forest.
So double counting is when the host country, say Vietnam, tells the UN, we reduced our national emissions by 1 ton using this forest. But then they also sell that exact same ton as a carbon credit to a massive tech company who claims it against their corporate emissions.
Exactly. 2 different entities are using the same ton of carbon to claim they are hitting their climate goals. But the atmosphere doesn't care about our accounting tricks.
Right. It only sees 1 ton removed, not 2.
Right. If double counting is allowed, the entire global carbon market collapses into a greenwashing scam. Vietnam's decree legally outlaws this, mandating that once a credit is transferred, it is meticulously tracked and removed from the national ledger.
And it also gets into the weeds on revenue management, too. It dictates that revenue from these carbon credits can flow through the Vietnam Forest Protection and Development Fund to directly support project monitoring and local community livelihoods.
Which is vital. Because if the local community living near the forest isn't seeing a financial benefit from protecting it, the trees will eventually be cut down. You have to align the economic incentives.
Now, if I'm a project designer listening to this, how should I navigate this new landscape? Is Vietnam handing us a perfect template? Let's just take Decree 180, translate it, and copy paste it into every developing nation.
The briefing is very explicit about this. Do not treat Decree 180 as a plug-and-play template.
Really? Why not? It sounds incredibly rigorous.
Because it is deeply, inextricably tied to Vietnam's specific state forest ownership laws. A carbon credit generated on land legally owned by the state in Vietnam has profoundly different underlying legal assumptions than a credit generated on, say, indigenous-owned territory in Brazil.
Ah, so you can't just mandate how revenue is shared if the foundational property rights of the country are completely different.
Precisely. Instead of blindly copying it, project designers should treat Vietnam's decree as a diagnostic framework.
Okay.
We need to look at it and ask, does our specific legal instrument definitively fix who owns the credit? Does it mandate bulletproof verification? Does it legally lock in equitable revenue governance before we try to scale the financial transactions?
It's a foundational checklist. And the true test won't just be the ink on the paper, it's going to be how it's enforced. Will local communities actually get their negotiated share? Especially as Vietnam's wider carbon market rules are expected to fully take force around 2028.
That is the ultimate question.
Okay, so we've established the nightmare of getting the money and the rigorous legal governance required to spend it responsibly. But let's throw a wrench into all of this. Let's say you clear the Pacific-style hurdles. You set up a pristine Vietnam-style legal structure for a massive mangrove restoration project.
Sounds great so far.
Right. And then, it's 2026, a Category 5 typhoon rolls in and physically obliterates the entire mangrove forest. All that carbon goes back into the atmosphere, the project is ruined, the investment is gone. Who pays for that?
That exact scenario is why the professional role of risk managers is completely evolving within climate finance right now. And it brings us to a high-level discussion on risk that just happened at the Insurance for Nature Positive Leadership Forum in Tokyo.
This was convened by the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative, or UNEP-FI, right? And hosted by MS&AD Insurance Group on July 17th.
Yes, and the numbers discussed at this forum really reframe the stakes. They cite a $700 billion annual nature finance gap.
Wow.
But the stat that I think stops you in your tracks is this: more than half of global economic value generation is moderately or highly dependent on nature.
More than half. Think about what that means. We aren't just talking about ecotourism. We're talking about supply chains, pharmaceutical research, real estate, manufacturing.
When an ecosystem collapses, the global economy takes a direct, massive hit.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This Tokyo Forum introduced a concept that flips how we normally think about finance. Usually we think of insurance as a product you buy to protect an asset. You buy a house, you buy fire insurance. Here, they are treating the insurance mechanism and the physical forest as two halves of the exact same system.
Yes, completely integrated.
Explain this to me. How does a mangrove forest become part of an insurance policy?
It's like installing a high-tech sprinkler system to lower your fire insurance premiums, except the sprinkler is a restored mangrove forest.
Ah, I love that analogy.
Right. Nature-based interventions physically reduce the risks to coastal cities. They absorb the wave impact, their roots hold the soil together, they do the physical work. Then, insurance mechanisms step into price, transfer, and pool the residual risk that remains.
Because no mangrove can stop a superstorm entirely.
Exactly. So they are completely codependent. If you only build the mangrove, you're totally exposed to catastrophic financial ruin if that superstorm hits.
Yeah.
But if you only buy insurance and don't restore the mangroves, the physical risk of climate change will just keep rising every year until the insurance premiums become completely unaffordable.
You have to pair the physical risk reduction of nature with the financial risk transfer of insurance, and this is giving rise to things like resilience bonds. What exactly is a resilience bond?
In a traditional model, a city issues a bond to build a concrete seawall. Investors give cash. City builds the wall, pays investors back with interest. A resilience bond applies that logic to nature. Investors provide capital up front to restore a coral reef.
Okay.
If a designated disaster does not occur, investors get a return. If a disaster does occur, the bond's capital is immediately released to the local government to fund emergency rebuilding.
That's incredibly clever. It front-loads the capital to build natural defenses while providing an insurance payout if the defenses are overwhelmed.
It is clever, but, and this is a very stern warning from the briefing, None of these clever financial instruments can scale without the governance architecture we just talked about in Vietnam.
Because a resilience bond requires absolute certainty on outcomes.
Right. Who legally verifies the forest is healthy? Who owns the land? If you don't have Vietnam-style regulatory clarity, institutional investors won't touch your sophisticated bond. The legal uncertainty is just too high.
It all connects back to the beginning. The global financial system keeps trying to inject fancy new solutions into the plumbing, but they keep ignoring the fact that the pipes themselves are either non-existent or fundamentally broken.
Which perfectly synthesizes the entire briefing into what they call the 4 narrow points of the pipe. This is the framework you can use to evaluate any climate headline going forward.
Let's explicitly outline this 4-stage test for you so you can see exactly where the global financial system is getting choked up. Stage 1 is allocation and eligibility.
This asks who qualifies for the money, and is there enough actual concessional grant money available, or is it all just loans? When the banks announced that $163 billion, they were almost exclusively addressing this single stage.
Stage 2 is access and preparation.
This is the Pacific Islands nightmare. The accreditation processes, the massive transaction costs.
That's 3 is financing terms and deployment.
Once approved, what are the fiduciary controls? Can you keep the expenditure traceable as it moves down to a local community?
And finally, stage 4 is outcome governance.
This is the Vietnam Decree. Legal rights, carbon ownership, rigorous ecological monitoring, and ensuring equitable revenue allocation.
If a single one of those 4 points is blocked, that $163 billion reservoir just sits there. So why should you care about these 4 points right now as we look at the rest of 2026?
Whether you are a project designer, a policymaker, or just someone who cares about climate action, you need to know that raising billions in aggregate commitments is only stage 1. And we're going to see these rules debated live at several major convenings very soon.
Right. The sources give us a specific watch list. In October 2026, we have the CBD COP17 in Armenia focusing on the global biodiversity framework.
In that same month, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, is expected to publish its nature-related disclosure exposure draft,
which will fundamentally change corporate transparency. We've also got Climate Week NYC in September, and in November, the Nature-Based Solutions Congress in Paris.
And for those tracking funds, the Blue Action Fund has a major deadline in October for Asian mangrove proposals. That is a live test of accessing the capital we've discussed today.
Raising billions is truly only stage 1. The real work is repairing the access and delivery architecture. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the true mechanics of climate finance.
It's been great. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. It builds directly on that UNEP FEI note. We learned today that more than half of global economic value generation is highly dependent on nature, yet we are struggling to pass capital through these 4 narrow points.
Yeah.
It raises a critical question. As the global economy faces mounting physical risks, are we spending way too much time celebrating the size of the water reservoir and not nearly enough time training the plumbers who actually know how to build the pipes?
A perfect question to leave hanging in the air. Keep questioning the headlines and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.